Welcome to the Underground QA podcast, everyone. I am your host today, Ariel Smith, and with me I have two additional QA professionals, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hey y'all, I'm Sarah Gallardo. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Chelsea Curran Adams, and my pronouns are she, her.
And my pronouns are also she, her. So today we're talking about Slither.io again. We talked about this game last week and we started brainstorming some ideas, or not last week, last time, sorry. We started brainstorming some ideas about how we might go about writing a test plan for it. And as you may or may not recall, we created a Miro board for that. Let me actually just go ahead and stream that so people can see it. So this was the result of our last episode. We basically looked at like each of the different areas of Slither and talked about some ways we might approach testing the functionality, localizability, and all the other FLRPs areas of testing last time. So this time we wanted to do a little bit something a little bit different here, but with the same game. So we're still talking about Slither, but now instead of doing this brainstorm of like ideas of things that we can test, we're gonna do a little bit of role playing. So today, the three of us are going to role play as a QA lead for Slither.io, and we have been told that Slither.io is going to be ported to console. And our responsibility is to make sure that it is successfully ported to console at the quality bar that we are setting with our partners. So, um, Sarah, Chelsea, do you have any thoughts on this exercise?
I think it's probably one of the most important things that you can do in terms of understanding what your role in the development process is for test planning and having those conversations. So I'm really excited to talk about our fictitious leadership negotiation skills today.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Sarah, did you have any thoughts?
I'm just excited to see y'all's process because, as I mentioned last time, this is a little more in depth than the things that I do. So I think it should be a pretty interesting learning opportunity.
Cool. Yeah, so maybe we should talk a little bit about our background with writing test plans. Like, Chelsea, have you ever done something like this where you've written a test plan for a game that was going to console?
Oh yeah, lots and lots. I think it's the nice part about console and writing test plans is examples like TCRs, XRs, and Nintendo's version of that. They kind of give you a really good idea of the testing, how you need to complete it. So you
Yeah.
just really need to, in test planning, think about the what and try to be smart about it and think about what you're missing that can help you make sure that you hit all of those guidelines. And so it's a really good time to start talking about the unique challenges of network pulls, for instance, which are the bane, I think, of everyone's existence at some point in time. But yeah, it's test planning for consoles, in my opinion, is easier but more stressful in some ways than other platforms.
Yeah, it's definitely more structured than like coming up with a test plan for anything, right? Because like regardless of the development studio, the console that you're porting to has very strict standards that you have to meet, right? So there is some amount of like guidance being given there just by virtue of them having requirements that other platforms don't. Like Steam is generally pretty lax with the type of like the quality of things that you can put on there. But consoles are much more strict, generally speaking. Um, cool. Well, so let's get into our role play session here, and let's start by trying to figure out like, okay, so what what exactly is our timeline like? So going back to what we had come up with, a summary of our backstory is we are a publisher porting this game to all modern consoles. So that includes a Switch, we'll say PS4 and Xbox One instead of the newer ones. Um, we have a year to do it, including both QA and dev time. Um, we are three possums in a trench coat, a single dedicated QA lead on the project, And then we have the ability to have dev engineers create some tools, i.e. bot snakes. When we were talking through the plan of this, one of the things that we realized is that a single QA lead would have a very difficult time testing a small project that requires a lot of humans to put it to the test. So this seems like a case where you would almost certainly want to have some kind of bot to like recreate uh, player snakes, because the servers for Slither.io can hold up to 500 people on them. And I just don't know. I don't know how easy it would be to like multi-box with 500 different keyboards or 500 different controllers. It seems like a good opportunity to use bots. So those are like our our constraints and our timeline, and I think we can start to work backwards from there. Does that sound good to the both of you?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So assuming we need to ship in a year, what kinds of like milestones would we want to work out with the production team? So like, when do we realistically think we could go to something like alpha or pre-production or beta or launch or whatever? Um, and is there something else we should be asking first before we dive into like let's throw some dates at a dartboard?
Yeah, so I think the first question I'd want to ask our production team is, uh, are we planning on a regular release cadence leading up to actually releasing to the public? So, do we want to kind of practice our release skills before we release? If so, then we should look at uh, really starting to hone and practice those skills in alpha, meaning we're starting to deliver more regularly. And can we test internally at the studio before that? So can we do internal deployments to get the studio to play together on console, to kind of test out those muscles, those release muscles as well?
Yeah. So I'm actually curious to know what when you say alpha, what do you usually mean by alpha? Because I've heard this term used a few different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask Sarah and I, we probably, and yourself, like we probably all three have different feelings. And I also think it's how long you've been in the game industry, honestly.
Yeah,
Because I think for those folks who've been in the industry, let's say over even probably 7 years, the industry has really changed in the past 7 years for what alpha is. We now
yeah,
have this idea that alphas get deployed to users, to players, and that used to not be a thing. Like alpha used to be considered internal, and
yeah,
beta used to be what was external. And now we're hearing things that are not that way. So I think that's a great like setting question. And for me, my hope is that alpha is a very closed situation, because when you hear like open alpha or closed alpha for players, I'm always like, ugh.
yeah. So let's just kind of briefly run through some of the different phases, and we can talk about how we'll use them here, just for the sake of brevity. So there's pre-production, which is like before you have even started making the game, the like the leads and the executives of the game are deciding who, like, what is this game, who's going to make it, how are we going to get those people. No actual game making really happens there. Maybe some prototyping just to like kind of flush out some ideas, but they haven't actually started to make the game. And then there's production. Production is we are now like actually making and producing the game. Um, so we have designers, we have engineers that are coding. We might have testers that are testing. I hope so. But sometimes people don't bring testers in until like later in production. And then there's alpha, and yeah, to me, alpha has always been an internal milestone. But I've also been at a company that had a public closed alpha, which I would have called a closed beta, but we called it alpha anyway. But alpha is generally like we have a completed playable game that is definitely like not ready to release. It's not even close to finished, but it like there is a game that can be played there enough that people can test it and evaluate it and say like, we should stop making this game or we should keep making this game or we need to change things about it. And then beta was always to me like the public facing alpha. Like now the game is there and it's either a closed alpha or a closed beta, meaning that it's by invite only, or it's an open beta, meaning that anyone who wants to jump in can jump in. And then after that comes launch.
Yeah.
There's lots of other milestones you can throw in there, like experience complete or vertical slices or like all kinds of like different milestones. But that's kind of like very high level what we're kind of thinking about here.
Ariel and Sarah, have y'all participated in pre-production work before with your teams?
Nope. I've only ever been on a team at production or later.
Same.
So it's very interesting because you may not even necessarily be in final engine. Like if you're not using a proprietary engine, you may even still be deciding what engine you're using. And so it's a really unique time to be a QA person that's involved in it. And I think truly helps make decisions on tooling and process going forward. It's really unique, and I think going to be more common because if we think about it, pushing for players to be able to access games earlier means that we need quality to be involved earlier in the game as well. And while we may not have an army of testers at that point, we definitely need folks from leadership or folks with design experience or engineering oriented QA people to be asking the tough questions. And it's where we can start to make some even really preliminary test plan questions and kind of frameworks happen.
So by the way, I think just talking about QA and pre-production sounds to me like a great episode, and we should definitely come back to that because I think that is a area that like not a lot of QA people have a lot of experience in because traditionally we're not invited into the process for pre-production. But God, I would love to talk about how QA could help at pre-production. I think here for us, pre-production is going to be like before we have started doing any of the work to actually port this console or port this game to console. It's all like the planning for how we're going to do it, how we're going to do the port. And I think in a case like this, you actually would see QA involved specifically to the extent that of what we're doing right now, in the sense that we would want to bring them in and have them help us plan, like, reverse engineer going backwards from cert, like what are our QA milestones going to be.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's do that.
So another of the biggest questions I would ask is, do we have very concrete deadlines we have to hit? Like, are we aiming for a holiday release so that folks can buy a copy of the game, or there's merchandise, or even for if you're working with IP, maybe we're releasing a limited edition Slither skin with our situation that coincides with the movie release. And so asking production about those kinds of things for timeline oriented questions is really important because we may not at all be able to shift. And it's really important to know whether we're hitting someone else's beat along with our own, because that's where you'll start to get very interesting morale situations and also very interesting schedule
Very
situations.
interesting morale situations. I like the way you put that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, in this case, our backstory is that we have a year to complete this. We can say that let's say it's fairly concrete. Like maybe it could be adjusted a little bit, but for generally speaking, QA has no control over launch dates anyway. So we're at least I personally find that I'm often working within the constraints of launch dates that someone else has given me, and then I can fight tooth and nail to change or adjust them. But yeah, let's say we're like pretty hard in our deadline of shooting for a year, but if we had to move it, we could.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. So let's how do you want to go about like trying to figure out how much time we're going to be spending in each of these phases. You want to work backwards from cert?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. Do we have information from when we did PC, or do we have information about when someone else did PC or mobile web?
Oh, about this game?
Yeah.
So I can tell you a few things about Slither. I don't think it's on console, but it was released on Android and iPhone at the same time as, or maybe no, it was just Android. It was released on Android at the same time as PC. The I know that the servers can hold up to 500 players, and it was also entirely made by a single person. So that was part of the reason why, for this narrative, I wanted to say that we were a port house, because I think that it's highly unlikely that a single developer would be able to port a game to all modern consoles by themselves unless they had like done it before or had some help. Um,
Sure. I think my question
so
was hypothetical in nature. Do we have any test data to draw on from
oh, I
before?
see what you're saying.
So, in order for us to back into dates, it would be really nice for us to know how long it took on our traditional platforms, or even if we could make it up, like take a good swag at it, that might help us. So, if we know our test cycle is going to be 3 days, for instance, we then know that the we'll have it with publishers for probably 2 to 3 days as well. That means our release cycle is going to be somewhere close to 6 days or whatever. So being
Yeah,
able to back into that with bug fixing and all of that, I think is a great way to start. So if you're working with your team, you can even have product to product comparisons. I don't know, Ariel and Sarah, if y'all have done that, but using the timeline from a previous project to inform the timeline for a future project can be a really great way to look at it, even if
yeah.
they're not exactly the same.
Um, well, I know that in the case of Slither.io, it was made by a single developer and like all by himself. So I don't think that they had any kind of QA team the first time around, and it was largely just kind of play tested by the players themselves. Um,
But I'm guessing we could contact the engineer and say like, "Hey, how long did it take you when you did your checks?" Probably.
yes, hopefully, assuming they did some.
So yeah, I would say, we can guesstimate and say that we had that conversation, but let's go ahead and safely say it's going to take 2 days or 3 days, and then 2 days with the publisher and maybe some bug fixing. So like 6 days total. How do y'all feel about that?
6 days to.
To get a release out the door, essentially, to get through our release pass and to get it through the publishing pass.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's the scope of the game is fairly small, right? So I think that that is fair. And then going back to what we talked about, we also have bots to help us to any degree that we need to, because that was like one of the assumptions we made going into this. Um, so okay, so you're saying it takes about 6 days to do like some basic release testing of a build. Um, would you say that that covers things like console certification or anything, or would we
Yeah.
also need to do separate passes for that?
No, I think that that's like going through cert sub fully. Like that's us checking it, submitting, fixing, submitting, fixing, submitting, fixing. See, anyway, so six. Yeah, six. I hope it's not that bad. Good lord, that's very expensive. Um, but yeah, I would say like 6 days is us doing everything we can, even with the bots, to go from we have a gold candidate to being we have gold.
Okay, and then how many people are you like factoring in and those 6 days? Is that like just the single QA
Great,
lead, or are they getting some help?
great question. So with bots, we need an engineer, right? A QA engineer at the very least, but it would be awesome if we have like both an engineer and a QA engineer to help with the bots because they're going to need help. And generally, the rule of thumb is 40% of your time uh, that it took you to create the automation is the time it takes to maintain the automation. If we look at historical context. So you need to make sure that you have someone to maintain, and then you probably need a good handful of folks to check through. So what were y'all thinking in terms of team size? Had you had that discussion yet?
Not really. But like, yeah. So I guess when I start thinking about team size, and I'm imagining the situation that we have here, like we have a QA lead who is basically like saying, here's this project. I imagine that like this QA lead probably has other projects that they're working on too at that time, because that's pretty common for a QA lead at a publisher house to like be kind of juggling a bunch of projects. Um, but that they would have some resources they could pull in to help them when they actually needed like help running test passes, for example, or um, if they needed to like hire some external testers, or whether they have their own internal test group who kind of shifts around to help the QA leads with their projects when they're going through testing. But I was imagining that it would be a solo lead who has some help from somewhere, whether that's an external team or an internal publisher team or something like that to help them. But given that the original developer is a single person, they're probably not going to have any QA resources that they can lend over aside from here are some of the tools that we've used. Um, so, and because it's a multiplayer game, I would want at least 2 people involved, just so that you could test like actual multiplayer in a real way. Um, Having the bots is useful for like trying to test the server capacity to make sure that when there's 500 snakes running around on a single server, it doesn't totally break. But there's some stuff that you want to be able to do very deliberately, and it's useful if the other person you're doing it with is an actual human. So I don't know. I would say that like if you're talking about doing a release pass, I would probably want at least 1 to 2 other testers to come in and help that QA lead run them whenever they're doing one of those passes. Um,
Yeah, I think a good rule of thumb is one person per platform so that you can run concurrently.
mm-hmm.
And so let's say we've got, it depends on whether you count PS4, PS5 as the same platform, which I don't. So PS4, PS5, Xbox, insert the alphabet, you know. And now we've got
Yeah, give
two,
give your consoles better names, Xbox. Jeez.
my friends at Microsoft, we love you so much. That's not, it is confusing sometimes to keep up with the alphabet of
Just
Xbox.
Xbox Two. Xbox Two. It's easy, right?
And then we've now got 2 switches as well. And so we may
Yeah.
have experience at this point to know whether or not we need to include some of those or not. But I think I would ask that we have available during the release cycle 1 person per platform. And if we're doing crossplay, then we'll also need someone on mobiles and someone on web.
Yeah.
And so, it may be temporary, but let's say we are able to get together 10 people. That would be awesome.
Here's a
Okay.
question for y'all.
Hmm.
So, would you build any redundancy into that? Would you have extra people in case, there's an outage or anything like that?
Good question. I think typically yes. In the past, we have overhired by X percentage, or even in working with external partners, they're very aware of that. So I don't think it's unusual for you to see overages in some spaces. It also allows for people to move up, to gain new experience and to take that experience to other spaces in the business. And so you'll see they even maybe training multiple leads at the same time and not charging. So if we're truly a porting house, then we may have multiple leads because we're training up our next lead to go on to a different project.
Yeah. So, um, backing back up again. So for this particular scenario, we are looking to have the lead with 1 person from each of the various consoles. So we're talking about an Xbox person, a PS4 person, an Xbox Series person, a PS5 person, and a Switch person, maybe 2. So like
Yeah.
6 people. Would we actually need 6 people though, or could we have 2 people that had 3 consoles each or something like that?
Well, it's a great question for the producers to say, like, hey, are you willing to pay for this? And for me, I would be asking for the more staffing so that we could have people truly concentrating. Um,
Yeah.
and if it's teams that are floating around, it's very likely that we have some form of team of 10 that could be looking across the platforms. So I would be asking for that. I would not even suggest that one person could do multiple platforms unless I was really being pressed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like there's very different reality to how you do things at a larger studio versus a smaller studio. A smaller studio, um, it might be like just a QA lead, and that's the only person in the QA department. So if you want any help, you're gonna have to like either reach out to the rest of your team and turn them into testers for a couple of hours, or look into using some kind of external QA house, or maybe you hire someone temporarily to help you just through the particular period. Like going back to the schedule, I think that with this project, you'll find that like you'll need more people as time goes on and the closer you get to cert, um, because there will be a lot more like stuff happening at the last second there. Generally speaking, when you have console ports, you see like there's like the first few months of pre-production where they're kind of like the engineers are figuring out how are we going to do this port, what sorts of things are we going to have to like change or sacrifice, like because maybe we're just not able to support the number of people we were hoping to support on a different platform. Maybe one of the platforms just doesn't have multiplayer, so we have to like make some single player version of Slither, um, or something like that. I don't know, but like that first period though is where like I think QA is really just trying to get a sense of how much is there going to be to test here, like how much are the engineers actually doing that I'm gonna have to do, that I'm gonna have to test. Because when you port to a console, like it's not like you're just making it run on that thing. There's a whole bunch of features that are associated with consoles that you have to support too, right? Like you have to be able to support being able to matchmake. You have to be able to support like jumping into a game with your friends. You have to be able to support rich presence, which tells people where you are when you're playing a game. Like there's all these like baked in features, and so that is like really what the console port work is like making the game compatible and supportive of those features, making it so that when my game is on Xbox, all of my Xbox friends can see that I'm playing Slither and join me. And that doesn't just that is kind of I think part of where the myth of the like magical checkbox comes from, is that like there's no magical checkbox that just makes it work on Xbox, right? Like you actually have to build that stuff. Um, so in pre-production, we would be looking at all of the features that the engineers are planning to build and coming up with a plan for how are we going to like test those to make sure they're working. But then also looking forward to cert at the list of requirements we're going to need to meet, and making sure that those lists of requirements are going to be appropriately met by the plans that are being come up with in pre-production. Um, so at that stage, I think you'll only need the QA lead, and we'll definitely need some testers like at the end and at certification. When do you think we need to start having people actually in the game and testing it?
I mean, I come from a different school of thought. So like I'm like testers on board yesterday. But I mean, I think even if you work with some publishers in terms of ports, they're that way as well. So I would rather say that we have 10 people available to schedule anytime starting
Mm-hmm.
today. And we may only schedule with them weekly for right now, but um, I I would recommend and have on previous projects that we have our full staffing available to us starting now, because they're going to need to get comfortable with the platforms. They're going to need to get comfortable with the project. They're going to need to ask a lot of questions, even if they're functional testing. We're going to need to figure out how to get logs. We're going to need to figure out how to get to data usage, for instance. In some cases, we're going to need to figure out how to access patching and how to download builds for consoles. So for me, I think I probably have a different answer than you were asking right there, but that's what
No,
I
that's
would
great.
suggest.
So you would
Sarah,
want to get your whole team involved at pre-production or production?
yeah, I don't know that we would have pre-production here, but if we did have pre-production, yes. If we don't have and it might be slimmed down in pre-production, right? We may have 3 people
Yeah,
or whatever. But
yeah.
once we hit production, once we're actually working, um, I, I would want the whole team to be staffed. Sarah, what are your thoughts there?
I think I agree with you. So I think when we're talking about functionality testing, as long as there's functionality, we should be testing it. And as soon as something's ready to go ahead and start looking at it.
Yeah.
Let's assume we may be doing one platform at a time. Maybe we have only a small dedicated set of folks for when we start, and then as we grow, because like Ariel, you just said, there's not a magic button. So we're also not probably going to turn on PlayStation and Xbox at the same time in terms of builds, unless we've got a ton of engineers at our disposal. So we may even need a ramp up time.
Yeah, so I mean, I had originally talked about having like, the milestones be like pre-production, production, and internal alpha, and so on. But those 5 milestones could be broken up into the same 5 milestones, but for each console. And I think that's actually pretty likely, right? So we might find that like we have all of the same exact milestones, but they're shifted down a little bit so that they all come like 2 months later for Switch or 2 months after that for Xbox. But I do think that like with a project like this, you would probably see certain milestones start to line up closer to the end, like launch and maybe the open
Yeah,
beta would be on the same day. We'd be like, we're on open beta for all of our consoles or something, because maybe we want to test crossplay or something like
yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
But yeah, I think that
Sometimes,
those first milestones we're probably doing like one console at a time or something like
yeah.
that, unless it's a port house that has separate teams for each platform, which would be wild. But
And sometimes you'll have deals that you make where you're out on a platform first. For instance, like I think Spirit Fair did the amazing, like, hey, we're releasing on everything by surprise, like on Switch and Steam at the same time. And that was a wonderful and amazing surprise that they did. But there may be some form of exclusivity that we've got to talk about too, or like exclusive pre-launch or whatever. Those are really important questions to ask too.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Oh my god, I'm gonna sneeze.
Woo! Bless you. That looked like a good one.
It was fiery. Um, cool. Okay, so it's interesting to me. I think that the difference of where I'm coming from is that I I wouldn't necessarily. I would want people there from the beginning, but I wouldn't necessarily want the whole team there at the beginning, because I feel like my my staffing needs might be different in production versus where they'll be in like as we're closer to our deadlines. Because like when work is coming in, like um like they're adding voice chat features, and they're adding friends features, and they're adding like all of these different things to the game. Like I need a certain number of testers to keep up with that amount of work so that they're staying on top of the things that are coming in as they come in. But then I need separate testers potentially for doing things like cert passes and performance passes and compatibility passes and those things, and those aren't the same as testing the work that's coming in. There's like additional kinds of tests that I would run on top of that. So I think I would want to have like a core team. Maybe it's just a QA lead. Maybe it's a QA lead plus 2 additional testers. I can't imagine it being less than 2 people in this case, just because it's a multiplayer game. But let's say like 2 people. I would have those 2 people there from like early on so that they could be testing the engineers' works as it's coming in. But then I would be looking for how can I staff up towards the end when I need to do full cert passes or when I need to do a performance pass, or maybe I pay to have a bunch of testers stress test my servers or something like that. Um, does that kind of resonate with you two in terms of approaching headcount?
I think it's just a different situation. So again, not to be like I would want an engineer, a QA engineer. I definitely want an analyst, and I would definitely want some testers. But what you said, it depends on if we're talking about pre-production or not. Once we hit production, it means that we're probably doing daily smoke passes of builds. It means that
Mm-hmm.
we're probably starting to really look at performance and stability in some way, shape, or form. So, on top of having an analytical force of folks, so an engineer digging into code, looking into logs, looking into analysis at the deeper level, and an analyst looking at data and risk from that perspective, I really would want from the get go. Once we say we're in production, I want a full suite of testers.
Yeah.
And if you're a port house, you're looking to do things as quickly as possible, so we're likely not constrained by budget.
And
uh
cheaply, I would think too. Like
yeah
they like people don't want to port they don't want to port builds to consoles for any more than they have to, because like it is basically like we are trying to just expand our audience and sell more copies of the game, right?
yeah
So if the port is itself more expensive than the copies I'll sell by doing it, then it's not going to be worth it. So I think there is an element of like I need to do this in a cost effective way. But yeah, I also like you want to like actually have like a full team that is just able to get this game to the quality I would like to see it at. Um, but I also know that at least in some projects I have been given less resources than I would necessarily want. So I'm actually curious if you got like let's say half the amount of money to do a console like to test a QA console port, what would be like what would be the things that are first to the chopping block? What would you like prioritize?
oh, I definitely prioritize the engineer and the analyst, or an engineer or an analyst first. And so let's say that counts as two people, two testers.
Hmm.
I don't think that that's exactly it, but let's just say that
That's
the
how
money wise,
finance
that's
does
what it
math,
looks like.
right?
Um, you know, I would take someone who can look at risk data and perhaps systematize that a little bit more over testing power early. And then I might rotate that person off. So again, if we're talking about like publishing and that level, we probably have a staff. They're probably not fully utilized all the time. So
Yeah.
I would first pick a QA engineer or a QA analyst, and then fill out as much as possible with testers. And again, knowing that we could say like, okay, I have testers Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or I have people who work the night only so that they can test the build for the morning for the team. I think there are a lot of ways that we can work to do part-time to get all 10 people we need. We just may need to think about what their schedules look like. So that would be the conversation that I would have. Like, okay, if you're going to give me half, I'm totally fine with that. Let's work out how we get as much coverage as possible with the money that we've got. And
It's very diplomatic of you to say you're totally fine with it, by the way.
well, I mean, here's the thing, especially like there may be circumstances that we don't understand that are going on. There may be, I don't want, the worst thing that we could possibly do is to bring people on and lay them off. The
Yeah.
best thing that we can do is to be very upfront with people about the load of work that they're going to have, and to be clear for the team. Now, let's say we can't work out a schedule like that. That's why test plans are so important. That's exactly why we're doing this. We're saying like, hey, if you staff me perfectly, I can guarantee you bronze, silver, or gold of a quality bar.
Yeah.
And we're always winning, right? Reminder that like bronze level of quality is still good. But if we don't get to here, And if we don't have these conversations, then we're not winning anymore.
Yeah.
We're actually losing. And so if you're going to give me half, I'm going to tell you how to get to bronze with half. We may not be able to.
Yeah. I think that's a good approach. Like when you have when you don't have the resources you want, you really need to demonstrate, explain to people what that's going to cost you.
Yep.
Like, okay, well, if I don't get the testers I need, then I might not be able to do like daily smokes of the build. Like, it might have to be a more casual, like, or less involved test pass than that, because just a time constraint. If the only person on the project is the QA lead themselves, then all of their planning time is cutting into their testing time, and vice versa. So that, like, there's going to be a less solid plan of action, because the person who makes it has their focus split. So yeah, I think as much as you can, like, demonstrating the consequences of uh
Yeah.
being shorthanded. So one way you might do that is, like, we're only going to be able to do half as many cert passes as we would like.
Yeah.
So whereas normally I would plan for extra cert passes so that we can kind of get out ahead of some of our potential failures and start investigating them early, you've only given me enough money for 2 passes. So we'll find out where we're going to potentially fail, we'll fix them, and then hopefully we pass on the second time, because I don't have the budget to do it more than that or something.
Yeah, it's
Um,
crazy too, because you're going to find that like those conversations make people very nervous, and then you start to talk about things like overtime and say like, okay, well, if you want me to get it done in 3 days, then we're going to have to work overtime. And if you're in the state of California, that means X over 50 hours equals not just time and a half, it's double pay,
yeah,
right? And so you have to be very conscious about what those situations are when we start talking about crunch. And so I think it's why, again, not to say it too much, but like it's why test plans are important. If you don't start to have these conversations early, your team's not going to be prepared for this. And it is the most fruitful conversation you can have to say, here's what our approach is going to be, and here are the risks to not doing it this way. And if you
yeah,
all agree, and then the plan changes, that's fine. You predicted it. You get clairvoyance essentially.
yeah. I'm trying to think of, like, what kinds of things I would be, like, looking at potentially cutting between on a console port team, and I feel like certification is one of the last things I would be interested in cutting, right? Like, it's
Yeah,
it's
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 too
just so.
expensive if you don't do it right.
Yeah, the risk is too high. It's super important, and at the end of the day, like, the main thing that you're doing there is you're trying to get the game certified, right? Like,
Yes.
that is QA's goal to an extent, on a console port, is like, we need it to pass cert, because if it doesn't pass cert, you can't ship it. End of story, right? There's just no way to get through pass cert except through it.
Yep.
Um, so I would be looking at things that, like, either have already been covered to some extent or another, or just aren't huge priorities, right? Like, it might be the case, for example, that there's no significant, like, functional changes in the game aside from those that directly relate to cert. So I might scale back the amount of, like, general functionality testing I'm doing. Um, uh, Outside of, like, making sure that we're passing cert. So I might reduce some of our tests in scope, like, bring the smoke test down to, like, maybe half its size, so we're just not spending as much time on it. And then I can save that time for cert later. I would maybe, like, I was gonna say maybe performance is something that you want to cut, but performance is so different from console to console that I don't think you can afford to skip something like performance testing. Um,
Ariel's making a perfect test plan right now, just verbally. Right?
I mean, yeah. So I think you would need performance testing. I think you would need certification testing still. You could maybe cut back on functionality testing. Let's go back to flirps. Like, what else do we need to worry about versus not worry about for a console port? Localizability?
I mean, yes. Well, so that's a good question. Like, are we in charge of localization? Do we need to understand? If we look at Slither right now, there are some countries that have flags that are displayed. What if one of those countries becomes a political situation? Like, do we need to pull up that risk? Do we need to be experts in it? There are external localization houses. We may even have one if we're a port studio. Like, that may be something that we are there. So I think we
Yeah.
definitely ask that question of like, hey, how in charge of internationalization and localization are we? I think the
Yeah.
other right left languages, left right languages, all of these things are things that we can start to have conversations about. Like, did you think about them in the test plan? And if it's not our concern, we move on. I think usability is perhaps the most important thing for platform changes, for platform shifts that you can have. And here's why. When you move from a touch screen, when you move from using this guy to using a mouse, there's very little change. However, when you move from touchscreen or mouse to controller, the world is a very different place.
Yeah.
And
No, go ahead.
and so we can't skimp on that. Like,
Yeah.
usability has to be the most important thing that we talk through. In my opinion, if we have to pick one thing that we spend all of our money in, which I hope that that's not the case, but if we have to pick one thing,
I
that's
mean,
what I would pick.
I would pick certification, but to your point, a certified game might not be a fun one if we didn't do any usability testing.
Well, you're not going to pass cert if you don't figure out the usability. For instance, pressing the Xbox button during the middle or pressing the PlayStation button during the middle
Oh,
of
I
the
see what you're
menu.
saying. Yeah.
Figuring out how to keep screens moving, because that's also a very interesting requirement, is that you have to have a moving item on a screen, even if it's a loading screen. If you don't have those conversations about how console is different from a user perspective and from a controller perspective, you're going to have a bad day. You're not going to pass cert.
It's funny that you mentioned the loading screen example because like that I was surprised to see that requirement really blow up on one of our projects, and part of the reason why was we kept on getting a stall on our loading screen. So this is actually a really common problem, and it's part of the reason why the requirement exists. But like sometimes when you're loading something, you'll hit a stall, and like your loading gear, whatever your loading symbol is, might just stop entirely because it's like trying to load. But it is a cert requirement that like is if something is happening, if the player like shouldn't give up and reset the console, there has to be some movement
Yes.
on screen. Yeah. And I don't know what it is, but that particular requirement is often a sore spot for
Yeah. I honestly don't know a project that I've worked on where it hasn't been a sore spot.
Yeah.
Truthfully.
Yeah, anyway. So it's interesting when we go through this list of like functionality, localizability, and like I'm looking at all of this stuff, like there's nothing here that like I want to cut, right? Like all of these tests feel pretty important to me even on a console port. So like how do you make that decision? How do you like decide like, oh, this thing that was really important and I definitely want to do, we're not going to do it because we just don't have time. Like
I'm so glad that you asked this question.
how do you decide what to cut?
This is what risk assessment is for, right? So
Yeah.
this is where we start to have the conversation of putting all of these things down into a risk matrix and looking at the likelihood and impact and kind of the severity of each of the things that we talk about here. If we don't have a first time user experience, does it matter? Are we looking to retain players or gain players? And my note in the risk assessment would be, if we're doing a port, we're probably looking to gain players, so it's probably pretty important for us to have some form of first time user experience, right? So I think it's where risk assessment comes to be really important, because I don't want to make those decisions, quite honestly, Ariel and Sarah. Like I don't. I want my producers to own that, so that they own the outcome of those situations. Or if it's a technical problem, like let's say they tell us, well, actually you're not going to have bots. Well, actually you're not going to have reliability and performance. Right? And
Yeah.
what are the consequences of those decisions? I don't get to make those. I just put them in front of people to make those decisions.
So I actually, really quick, I just want to share this article with folks who might be interested in it. It is called "Game Creators Scramble to Keeps Up." It's a Slither.io article that was written on the Washington Post and has since been reposted on the Slither.io website. But one of the things that this article talks about is that when the game was first blowing up, that one of the problems that the creator had was that the servers were struggling to keep up with all of the people who were like jamming into the game. So this is something that I would definitely want to call out in a risk sheet as like we had this problem in the past where the server actually just straight up died and started kicking people. So this is something that we're going to want to look at here. I could even see sacrificing some of the tests that I still care about if I needed to make sure that the servers were stable, because I think as a QA lead I'd be coming in and being worried most about that since it's been a problem in the past. How would we test something like this? How would we make sure that the game is actually going to be able to support 500 people per server and many servers on top of that?
Worst case, we're multi-boxing, right? So best case, we have bots to do this. Middle case is we get everyone on the studio, or everyone in 17 studios or whatever that we're affiliated with, because that's the way the game industry works right now. We get as many people to log in as we possibly can. And again, like I think we just call out the risk, like we let production know. And I think also realize, if you're in this situation, that you as the QA lead are not responsible for figuring out how to get all of these people or all of these sessions started. You're responsible for asking how we're going to do it. Like I think that that's something that we as QA people get caught up in a lot, is we don't have to solve all of these problems, but we do have to ask a question of how we can do it. Because if you say, like, if someone responds to you and says like, well, it looks like you're logging into 15 different or 500 different Windows sessions and doing this, like Pyro in the chat said, like, you're gonna get overtime. You're gonna have that situation, right?
Yeah.
If we have to start 500 sessions up on consoles, but that's not a problem I'm interested in solving. Like, you engineers tell me how to solve this problem.
Yeah. Um, yeah, this is honestly like the way servers work is often very opaque to QA too. Like I have had to have like server engineers like, all right, sit me down and explain our servers because I need to understand them in order to test them. But at the end of the day, all kinds of bugs still happened in spite of that understanding that I couldn't have even began to test for, because I didn't have like the knowledge to understand it. So I think you're right in that like we would really depend on like the engineers' help in figuring out how to address this problem. It's not something we could figure out ourselves. Um, but it would be something that I would be like worried about constantly, even if um, I knew that there was only so much I could do about it. Um, but there are lots of ways to approach it, right? Like you had talked about with bots, you could also um, hold like a closed beta event, like going back to what we were talking about with our milestones. I think one thing we could do is plan to have that closed beta event where we would invite, I don't know, like maybe 10,000 people or something like that to come jump onto our servers and just hammer them for an hour or something like that to see what happens. Um,
And that's very common, right?
That's
Like
super common, yeah.
a lot of studios will be testing true betas, and now what we're probably calling alphas are there to do scalability testing in some cases. It is so expensive to spin up bots. I don't think people realize how expensive it can be, but when you're spinning up bots for automation, don't forget that you have to have a place. You're either creating AWS instances or some form. You're spinning up machines, probably virtualized ones.
Yeah.
True scalability tests can be tens of thousands of dollars per time
Yeah.
you run it.
And we should also say that like not all bots are made alike.
No.
Like there are bots, for example, that don't actually appear in the game. They just kind of simulate what it would be like if a player was playing the game, and they
Yes.
hit it with like an approximate load of a player, but there's nothing actually happening there in game. Other times there are like bots that literally we're making a fake character that appears in game and runs around and hits things and loots and does all that stuff. And the more complicated your bot is, the more maintenance it's going to take, and the more time and money you're going to have to spend on maintaining it.
That 40% rule is where exactly what that's talking about. 40%
Yeah.
of the time it costs you to make the automation, it's going to take to maintain the automation.
Yeah. But yeah, in this case, I don't know how you would test a game that has like 500 people on a single server without bots of some kind. So there'd probably be several discussions about what are the bots and how are they going to work. So there's so many other things we could have gotten into here today. Honestly, an hour just doesn't feel like enough time to fully digest how are you going to test a console port. But I think we got into some good questions and some good discussion here. So I think it was good and productive, and I appreciate you both for taking the time to talk through this stuff with me. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up our episode there. I don't know if we're going to come back to Slither again. Maybe we will. Maybe there's still more to talk about here. It's such an interesting exercise to actually have like a concrete example to like talk through like this. So thank you both for participating. Did either of you have a bug of the day that we can talk about today? Or maybe someone does in chat? I would love a bug of the day. If not, I might just have to tell stories about. Oh, actually, I have a really good bug of the day.
There we go.
This happened on a previous project, and it's related to servers and bots and all sorts of juicy things. So what had happened was we were having this problem where a very small percentage of matchmaking would fail. And we could not for the life of us figure out why. It seemed to be entirely random. But eventually, someone, one of our producers, was looking at the zone IDs of the various zones when we were trying to matchmake. And I don't know how he figured this out, but somehow he noticed that the zone IDs, when matchmaking failed, always had letters in them, and the rest of the time they only had numbers in them. And it turned out that one of our servers was basically taking data that was given to it from another server and changing the information if it didn't understand it correctly. So when it got a zone ID that had letters in it, it would convert it to just be numbers, essentially. And this was happening entirely invisible to everyone, right? But it was completely random because it was entirely driven by, did the zone ID have letters in it or did it not? And if it didn't have letters, it passed fine. If it did have letters in it, it failed. And about 1% of all of the zone IDs had letters in them and then would fail. This was a bug that plagued us for so long, I can't even begin to describe. But there was absolutely no way anyone could have possibly have figured it out unless we were looking at the actual zone IDs and noticing that when they failed, they had this in common with them. Anyway, and the bots we had were also failing with this percentage. So we had bots that were like moving around in matchmaking and stuff, and they were also getting disconnected at the same rate too. So we knew that it wasn't anything that the player was like doing because it was happening pretty consistently regardless of what they were doing prior to traveling. But anyway, yep, that's the bug of the day.
I like your bug of the day.
Check those zone IDs for letters.
I like it. It's very technical. Good.
Thank you, Chelsea. And thank you, everyone else who came to watch us today. We really appreciate it. We'd like to thank you all because we wouldn't be doing this podcast without you. If you have any suggestions for future topics or bugs of the day, we'd love to hear them. If you are a QA professional and would like to be on the podcast, we would love to have you. Please just get in contact with us via undergroundgameqa@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us on Twitter at undergroundqa, because we'd love to hear from you and collaborate. And I just want to say that uh, there are four of us who host this show, and like I personally would really love to get some more people involved in hosting. Like we're really not interested in just trying to keep it to just our four voices. We very much appreciate it when we get other people in. So if you are interested in becoming one of the hosts of Underground QA, let us know. We would really love to hear from you because I think the more diverse of a cast that we have, a roster that we have to pull hosts from, the better. So let us know if you're interested. Anything else, gang? Anything you want to plug?
Sarah, you want to give a plug?
Yeah, I'll plug our Discord, which I know Ariel just did, but this conversation actually sparked a couple questions, so I'm going to be moving those questions into our Discord and hope for some lively discussion there.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, our Discord is the place to be. It's very social. We even have a pets channel, y'all. Come show off your pets.
Also,
yeah,
we're going to look into starting up some social events sometime soon for folks in the Discord. So look forward to that, and hopefully we can get a chance to like see y'all's faces and chat more about QA. That'd be great.
For me, I'm gonna plug a book. I'm a big reader. It is called Set Boundaries, Find Peace. It is by Nedra Glover Tawwab. I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Ms. Tawwab. But she is on Instagram. Her posts are amazing. It is about all kinds of relationships where you need to set boundaries and understand, even with yourself, how to find happiness and find peace. Actually, let's say peace, because happiness is a myth in terms of being happy all the time. Do not strive to be happy all the time. Strive to be at peace and content, and really enjoy and embrace happiness when it happens. But I think find a good book for you to find your peace. And if you want to start with this one, it's very good.
I might have to check it out. I'm actually looking for some books to take with me to Hawaii when I go next week. So
Vacation Flex for the century there. I'm so excited.
Ariel reading that book on a beach sometime in the near future, I think will happen.
Cannot wait to hear all about your adventures. Please eat lots of pineapple and poke for us.
Will do. All right, gang. Well, thanks again for joining us this week. Please keep testing, keep washing your hands, and we will see you all soon.